There's a phrase that FIFA has repeated so many times, across so many press releases and so many carefully worded official statements, that it has become almost background noise. Football unites the world. You will have seen it on stadium signage. You will have heard it in broadcast packages. You will have read it in tournament brochures. FIFA promises, and this is the exact language they use, a World Cup where everyone feels safe, included, and free to exercise their rights. That is not a vague aspiration. It is not a hope or a wish. It is a specific, documented commitment made by the governing body of the most widely watched sport on Earth. And it is a promise that, as of the moment this tournament begins, is being broken across so many dimensions simultaneously in so many documented, verified, on-the-record ways that the gap between what FIFA told the world this tournament would be and what the world is actually experiencing has become one of the most extraordinary acts of institutional dishonesty in the history of international sport. And what makes it even more extraordinary is that the organizations calling FIFA out on it are not fringe activists or anonymous internet accounts. They are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP, Reporters Without Borders, the AFL-CIO. More than 120 civil society organizations, including some of the most respected human rights institutions on the planet, have stood up in the months and weeks before this tournament began and said the same thing, loudly and in public. FIFA is not keeping its promises. And then they listed exactly which promises are being broken, one by one, in detail that is impossible to dismiss and impossible to ignore if you are paying any attention at all. Let us start at the very beginning of the story, because the beginning matters enormously for understanding the scale of what is being broken. When FIFA awarded hosting rights for the 2026 World Cup back in 2018, it did so with a specific framework that was supposed to make this tournament historically different from everyone that came before it. For the first time in FIFA's history, human rights criteria were embedded directly into the bidding process. Each of the 16 host cities across the United States, Canada, and Mexico was required to develop and implement a human rights action plan. A specific, documented strategy to prevent discrimination, protect workers, safeguard children, and address the range of rights risks that come with hosting a mega sporting event. FIFA went on record saying, FIFA is committed to respecting all internationally recognized human rights, and shall strive to promote the protection of these rights. That statement was not buried in a technical document. It was a cornerstone of the entire bid process. It was, in effect, FIFA's promise to the world that this tournament would be different, that they had learned from Qatar, from Russia, from every controversy that had dogged the organization for years, and that 2026 would mark the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter in which human rights were not an afterthought, but a foundation. And then Human Rights Watch, along with the Sport and Rights Alliance and multiple partner organizations, conducted an assessment of those human rights action plans just months before the tournament began. What they found should have been a front-page story in every sports publication in the world, all but one of the host city committees had either completely failed to produce the required human rights action plans or produced plans that were so inadequate, so thin, so devoid of concrete commitments, that they failed to meaningfully address any of the rights risks they were supposed to cover, all but one, out of 16 cities, in the first World Cup that was supposed to be built on a human rights framework. The foundational promise of this entire tournament's supposed new direction was effectively not implemented. The plans either did not exist or were not fit for purpose. And FIFA, which collected billions in broadcast rights and sponsorship deals and ticket revenue while those cities were supposed to be building those plans, had no public enforcement mechanism that anyone could see. The plan requirement existed, the compliance did not. Now, if that were the only broken promise, this story would still be alarming. But it is only the first layer, because stacked on top of it, one on top of the other, like floors in a burning building, are a series of specific, documented failures that together paint a portrait of a governing body that made commitments it either never intended to honor or had no realistic mechanism for keeping. Start with the question of who can actually get into the country to watch these matches. Because FIFA's own contractual framework required that all participating nations and their supporters have unrestricted access to the host country. This was not a suggestion. It was a condition of hosting. When Infantino was asked about this principle in 2017, his language was unambiguous. He said, "It is obvious when it comes to FIFA competitions. Any team, including the supporters and officials of that team who qualify for a World Cup, need to have access to the country. Otherwise, there is no World Cup." Those were his words. And by the time the tournament begins, fans from 4 qualifying nations, Haiti, Iran, Ivory Coast, and Senegal, are barred from entering the United States under travel bans imposed by the Trump administration. Fans from Cape Flores, from Verde and Algeria face bond requirements of up to $15,000 just to apply for entry. 39 nations in total face some form of restriction or barrier. A Somali referee, selected by FIFA itself to officiate at the tournament, was denied entry at an American border and sent home. His World Cup was over before it started. An Iraqi player was detained and questioned for hours at an American airport. The journalist covering an Iraqi team was denied entry after his phone was searched by border agents. These are not statistics. These are specific human beings whose relationship with this tournament was severed by the host country's enforcement apparatus. And FIFA, which had the power to refuse the tournament to any country that could not meet its own access guarantees, chose instead to continue, award itself another $15 billion revenue event, and hope that nobody looked too closely at the gap between what it promised and what it delivered. The human rights organizations looked very closely. In March of this year, Amnesty International released a 36-page report titled Humanity Must Win: Defending Rights, Tackling Repression at the 2026 FIFA World Cup. The title itself is a statement of urgency. And the contents are not vague expressions of concern. They are a systematic, category-by-category documentation of rights, failures affecting fans, players, journalists, workers, and local communities across all three host nations. The primary focus of the report is the United States, which is hosting 78 of the 104 matches, and which Amnesty describes as facing a human rights emergency. The report details what it calls the machine of abusive, discriminatory, and potentially deadly immigration enforcement operating across the country, a system that Amnesty says poses a chilling threat not only to visitors arriving for the tournament, but to people already living in host cities, including stadium workers whose families may be at risk. Amnesty's head of economic and social justice put the scale of the deportation regime in context with a single comparison. The United States government deported more than 500,000 people from the country in 2025. That is more than 6 times the number of people who will watch the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium. 6 times. The enforcement machinery dwarfs the tournament it is supposed to be surrounding. And the ACLU, the organization that has spent decades defending the constitutional rights of people in precisely this country, joined that coalition of 120-plus groups to issue a formal travel advisory. Not a guideline, not a recommendation, a warning. The advisory tells fans, players, journalists, and visitors that coming to the United States for this World Cup carries the risk of arbitrary denial of entry, detention, deportation, invasive searches of electronic devices, racial profiling, surveillance, suppression of speech and protest, and what it describes as cruel or degrading treatment in immigration detention. That is the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, warning people about traveling to the United States of America. That is not normal. And FIFA, which has the legal standing and the contractual authority to demand that these conditions not exist as a precondition of hosting, has not exercised that authority in any meaningful or enforced way. But the human rights failures of this tournament are not limited to immigration enforcement. They extend in directions that reveal something deeply troubling about FIFA's pattern of making commitments it neither enforces nor appears to take seriously once the cameras are rolling and the money is flowing. Consider what happened at the Club World Cup in the United States in 2025, the tournament that FIFA explicitly framed as a trial run for the 2026 World Cup, a dry rehearsal for how the governing body would manage a massive tournament on American soil. Before the Club World Cup, FIFA had publicly announced a range of anti-discrimination activations for the event. Signs planned for stadiums, video campaigns, social media initiatives designed to communicate to players and fans that homophobic chanting would not be tolerated. And then, according to reporting in The Athletic, FIFA shelved those activations, removed the signs from the stadiums, canceled the campaigns. This was happening at the same time that homophobic chants were being directed at goalkeepers during matches. FIFA had the activations ready. FIFA had the messaging prepared. FIFA chose not to deploy it. The organization only partially reversed course after significant public criticism, reintroducing some anti-racism messaging, but not the full package that had been planned. An out-professional athlete who participated in advocacy around this issue said it plainly. LGBTQ players and fans need more than symbolic gestures. We need enforceable protections. The chants at the Club World Cup in Atlanta show exactly why FIFA's retreat from anti-discrimination messaging is so dangerous. Players and fans must know that FIFA will protect them, not abandon them. That quote is from a former men's professional player in the United States. That is not a critic from the outside. That is someone who played this game, who understands the environment inside these tournaments, who watched FIFA back away from its own stated commitments at the exact event that was supposed to demonstrate FIFA could be trusted to run a safe and inclusive World Cup. And the World Cup is now here. The chants have not stopped. The commitments have not strengthened. For LGBTQ fans, what is happening at this tournament is not a disappointment. It is a betrayal. And the betrayal cuts particularly deep precisely because this tournament was supposed to be different. This was not Russia. This was not Qatar. Those tournaments were always going to be difficult or impossible for LGBTQ supporters, and the organizations representing those fans said so loudly at the time and were largely ignored. But the 2026 World Cup in North America, in the United States and Canada, countries with established, if increasingly contested, legal frameworks protecting LGBTQ people, was supposed to be the tournament where queer fans finally got to show up fully. The official LGBTQ supporters group for the England men's national team is called Three Lions Pride. It has around 350 members. It attends matches regularly. It has maintained a visible, proud presence at tournaments for years. Three Lions Pride announced in January that it will not attend the 2026 World Cup. Not because it does not want to, because it does not believe it is safe. The group released a statement saying that the dangerous rollback of human rights in the United States has caused significant concern for fans who had been planning to attend. They said they could not, in good conscience, tell their members that they would be safe going to this tournament as openly LGBTQ fans. One member of the group, speaking to Amnesty International and identified only by a changed first name for their own protection, described the feeling of this moment in terms that should stop any football fan cold. This is probably the one that has disenfranchised LGBTQ fans like no other World Cup, this person said, because it had so much hope. We knew Russia was going to be difficult. We knew Qatar was going to be almost impossible. But this one had so much optimism. That is a person who has watched World Cup after World Cup from the margins of the fan experience, waiting for the tournament that would finally feel safe enough to attend without fear, and discovering that the one that promised inclusion most loudly has delivered it least of all. And the situation for transgender fans carries a specific danger that goes beyond general hostility. Following an executive order from the Trump administration, the United States State Department finalized rules in March 2026 requiring visa applicants to list their sex as assigned at birth on their application forms. For transgender fans who have transitioned and whose passports now reflect their gender identity rather than the sex assigned at birth, this creates an impossible situation. If there is a discrepancy between what their passport says and what the visa application demands, it can be flagged as potentially fraudulent. The consequences of that flagging can include entry refusal, detention, and permanent bans from the United States. There are no exceptions. There are no workarounds for the World Cup. Transgender fans from other countries who want to attend are, in practice, facing a situation where exercising their legal identity in their home country could result in detention at an American border. FIFA, which had inserted human rights frameworks into its hosting criteria and which had pledged a safe and inclusive tournament, has not obtained any exemption from these rules for World Cup visitors. GLAAD noted that despite heavily promoting a campaign called Unite for Inclusion during the 2023 Women's World Cup, FIFA has simply omitted that campaign from the messaging framework for the 2026 Men's World Cup altogether. The inclusion message that FIFA used to promote itself 4 years ago is absent from the most inclusive World Cup FIFA promised to run. That gap between the women's tournament messaging and the men's tournament silence tells you everything about where inclusion sits in FIFA's genuine priorities when revenues are at their absolute maximum. And then there's the question of children. If you were designing a human rights framework from scratch and asked anyone from any background what the single most urgent protection a global sporting event should have is, you would almost certainly arrive at the same answer: protect the children who attend and participate. Major sporting events draw enormous crowds, create complex environments of movement and access, and are known to be associated with risks, including trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. FIFA itself acknowledged this when it awarded hosting rights in 2018. The organization went on record saying that child safeguarding was a top priority for the 2026 tournament, and Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading human rights organizations, formally stated that FIFA has no child safeguarding policy for the 2026 World Cup. Not an inadequate policy, not a weak policy, no policy. The specific risks that children face in the context of major sporting events, trafficking, sexual exploitation, child labor, family displacement, have no FIFA-level protection framework attached to them for the tournament that is currently being played. The organization that described child safety as a top priority when it needed the hosting bid to succeed has arrived at the tournament without the policy it promised to build. FIFA's own safeguarding statement, when it eventually published one, came 8 years after the bidding process and host city announcements, raising the question of how any host city was supposed to build an adequate child protection plan when the governing body's own framework did not arrive until the preparation period was already over. Now step back and take the full picture in. You have a governing body that promised a human rights framework was embedded in the hosting process, and all but one of the host cities failed to deliver adequate human rights action plans. You have a governing body that promised unrestricted access for all participating nations and their fans, and fans from 4 qualifying countries cannot enter the host nation. You have a governing body that ran a trial event and then canceled its own anti-discrimination messaging while homophobic chanting was happening inside the stadiums. You have the official LGBTQ supporters group for one of the tournament's biggest teams announcing they will not attend because they do not believe they will be safe. You have transgender fans facing a legal trap between their identity documentation and the host country's visa rules. You have no child safeguarding policy for a tournament involving millions of attendees across 16 cities in 6 weeks. And you have a coalition of 120 plus civil society organizations, including Amnesty International and the ACLU and Human Rights Watch and the NAACP, issuing formal travel warnings to potential visitors. That is not a fringe concern. That is a mainstream, multi-organization, multi-continent alarm being raised about the world's biggest sporting event in real time. What is FIFA's response to all of this? The answer is revealing in its consistency. FIFA responds with language, statements affirming its commitment to human rights, assurances that the tournament will be safe and welcoming for all, references to the human rights framework that was supposed to be embedded in the hosting process. And then, when pressed on specific failures, when asked why the action plans are not complete, when asked what the enforcement mechanism is for the access guarantees, when asked where the child safeguarding policy is, the responses become vague or silent. One advocacy director at Amnesty International described the dynamic plainly. FIFA, despite the commitments it made, evidently has not been able to secure the guarantees it promised. And despite its close relationship with the Trump administration, it has not been able to translate that relationship into meaningful protections for the people its own framework was supposed to protect. FIFA built a political relationship around flattery and proximity, and when that relationship was tested by its own contractual obligations to fans and players and workers and communities, the relationship produced nothing of substance. The promises existed on paper. The enforcement did not exist anywhere. But here is the dimension of this story that should make every single football fan who watches this tournament angry in a way that goes beyond politics. The workers who built the infrastructure for this World Cup, who retrofitted stadiums and constructed facilities, and who will serve food and clean seats and drive shuttles and work security shifts, those workers deserve fair wages, safe conditions, and the right to organize. That is not a radical demand. That is the minimum standard any major employer is supposed to meet in any country that describes itself as a democracy. The AFL-CIO, the largest federation of trade unions in the United States, put it in terms that leave no ambiguity. FIFA cannot claim to celebrate peace while ignoring the conditions of the people who make these games possible. Workers at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, one of the flagship venues for this tournament, voted to strike over fears that immigration enforcement agents could be deployed on stadium grounds during matches, putting their colleagues and family members at risk of detention. Think about what that means. Stadium workers voting to strike not over wages or hours, but over the fear that the federal government will show up at their workplace during a football match and take people away. That is the environment that the workers maintaining these venues are operating in. And FIFA, which is about to collect $15 billion from this tournament, which required those cities to sign contracts that stripped them of revenue while loading them with costs, which moved its operational headquarters to Florida to take advantage of the tax environment. FIFA has not obtained any guarantee that the workers making this tournament possible will be protected from the enforcement machinery operating in the host country it chose to partner with. There is a phrase that the coordinator of Dignity 2026 used that captures the full moral weight of everything that is being allowed to happen here. For the World Cup to truly unite the world, both FIFA and host committees need to ensure that the rights and dignity of everyone, whether residents or visitors, are protected and not exploited. And then the coordinator added something that should be engraved on every FIFA press release until it is actually true. People who are unsheltered should not be criminalized for their status or displaced as part of so-called beautification efforts ahead of a tournament. Because that is what is happening in host cities. The most vulnerable people in those communities, the people who have no home, no shelter, no institutional protection of any kind, are being swept from public spaces as part of the visual preparation for an event that will broadcast images of those same streets to 5 billion people. The World Cup arrives, and the unhoused are moved along so the cameras can frame the city without them. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And FIFA's human rights framework, which was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation of vulnerable communities, is not stopping it. There will be extraordinary moments in this tournament. There will be goals that people remember for decades. There will be performances that define careers and matches that define generations. The football itself will be real and genuine and beautiful in the way that football at its best always is. None of that is diminished by what is happening around it. But the football does not exist separately from the context in which it is played. The fans sitting in those stands are sitting in those stands because FIFA promised them safety, inclusion, and the free exercise of their rights. The fans who are not sitting in those stands, the Haitian supporters who cannot enter the country, the Senegalese families who were blocked at the border, the transgender fans who were told their identity papers create a legal risk, the LGBTQ supporters groups who decided the tournament was not safe enough to attend, those people were also promised something. They were promised a World Cup where football unites the world. And what they received instead was a World Cup where the promises were written down and the commitments were announced and the frameworks were named and the statements were issued. And where, when the moment came to actually enforce them against the financial interests of the people with the power to do so, every single one of those promises quietly dissolved into the distance while the $15 billion moved in the opposite direction. The organizations fighting for those promises to be kept are still fighting. They are still issuing statements, still filing complaints, still holding press conferences and publishing reports and demanding that FIFA match its rhetoric with action. And FIFA is still issuing statements in return, affirming its commitment to the values it is simultaneously failing to uphold. That is the loop. That is how this works. The statement and the counter-statement. The promise and the broken promise, the framework and the absent enforcement. And somewhere in the gap between those things, millions of real people, fans and workers and players and communities, are navigating a tournament that was supposed to be the safest, most inclusive, most rights-respecting World Cup in history, and is instead the one that proves more completely than any that came before it that when FIFA says football unites the world, what it actually means is that FIFA's bank account unites FIFA's shareholders. Everything else is a press release.